To build a modern interactive application, you're going to need the ability to listen to and respond to events, obviously. Thankfully, the API to do this in React is fairly simple, and it involves two things you're already familiar with, props and functions. Let's start off with the most basic example, alerting whenever a user clicks on a button. First, we'll start with a button element. Now let's create a function which will encapsulate the logic for what happens when a user clicks on the button. We'll call it handleClick. Finally, we want to tell React to invoke our handleClick function whenever a user clicks on our button element. To do that, we can pass button an onClick prop, which will be set to our handleClick function. Now, whenever the button is clicked, React will invoke handleClick. Basic, yes, but this example demonstrates some important concepts and patterns that are consistent regardless of the complexity of the event you're listening for. First, it's a good idea to encapsulate the event handler into its own function, and it's common practice to name the function handle plus the name of the event, in our case, handleClick. Next, you'll notice that we're passing our event handler as a reference to onClick, not as an invocation. Note the difference between these two onClick props. For the record, this is true for passing any function as a prop and not just event handlers. Always pass your functions as references, not invocations. Next, you'll notice that we created our event handler inside the component, not outside of it. This is also a common pattern, but it may feel unintuitive at first. Can you think of why we do this? To see why, let's adjust our example a bit. Instead of alerting, let's alert whatever is passed in as the message prop to our alert button component. By declaring our handleClick function inside of our component, we automatically have access to the message prop via JavaScript's normal lexical scoping rules. Notice what happens when we move handleClick outside of the component. We no longer have access to message via scope. Instead, we have to pass it as an argument to handleClick, which forces us to create another function that we pass to onClick. This indirection is unnecessary and is a good indication that we should move handleClick back inside of our component so we can take advantage of lexical scoping. One reason why your intuition might be telling you to move handleClick outside of the component is because you're worried about performance. If it's inside the component, then JavaScript will have to recreate the new function every time the component renders, right? That's correct, and that's mostly fine. Turns out, JavaScript is really good at creating and destroying functions, to the point where it's usually a non-issue. For the very few edge cases where this isn't true, we have some options we'll learn about later in the course. So at this point, you know how to add a click handler to a button, but let's look at a scenario that isn't straight out of a generic React tutorial. Say we wanted to build something like this, a little game where the user has a certain amount of time to copy the main emoji from a list of smaller emojis. Fun. Let's start off with the easy parts first, just the UI. We'll have an array of emojis, a function for selecting a random emoji, and some JSX. Now let's work on our event handler that will pass as an onCopy prop to each of our three emojis. This event handler will need to check if both the user copied the right emoji as well as if they did it in under 5 seconds. This does bring up a new scenario though. We now need to know some specific information about the event that was triggered. Specifically, we need to know which emoji was copied so we can see if it was the right one. This brings us to the last piece of knowledge you need for managing events in React. Whenever an event handler is called by React, React will pass an object as the first argument to the event handler that contains all of the information about the event that was triggered. In our example, that event object will look something like this. Though there's a lot of extraneous data here, there are a few things that'll be helpful to us, namely the target and timestamp properties. Target is the element that triggered the event. We can use it to figure out which emoji was copied by comparing its inner text to the selected emoji. Timestamp tells us how long it's been since the document finished loading and the event occurred. We can use that to figure out if the user copied the emoji before 5,000 milliseconds had passed. And if neither of those cases evaluate to true, they're a winner. Now the only thing left to do is create our event handler for our reset button. This one is simple. We'll just call location.reload to reload the page. And that's it. Now if the user copies the right emojis in under 5 seconds, they'll get a winner alert. Now before we end, if you're an experienced web developer, you're probably aware that there are a lot more events you'll eventually want to listen for other than just onClick and onCopy. For your future reference, here's every event you can listen for inside of React.